Thank you, Chris, and my thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. During the last 30 years, I've had the good fortune to direct or co-direct excavations at two legendary sites in Turkey, Troy and Gordian. Recently, while completing part of the Troy final publication, I faced the unenviable task of presenting my own research in historiographic perspective, while attempting to maintain as much objectivity as possible. And this talk is an extension of that exercise. I've tried to highlight the positive and negative aspects of both the Troy and Gordian projects in as much detail as possible, with a focus on the extent to which regional, national, and global developments shaped our research agendas. I'll also include some broader thoughts on the discipline of archaeology in Turkey and the Middle East at the end of this talk, since the field has changed so radically in the last 2 decades. At first glance, Troy and Gordian have many points of similarity. Both are multi-period sites in Anatolia, with habitation spanning nearly 4 millennia, from the 3rd millennium BC to the Seljuk and Byzantine periods. Both consist of monumental citadels with surrounding burial mounds or tumuli, and both had also been excavated for decades by the time I assumed responsibility for fieldwork. The techniques of excavation and conservation have changed dramatically during the course of exploration of these two sites, and one can read these changes to an extent in the current appearance of the ruins. What might not be as readily apparent are the ways in which the history of the excavation has affected the strategies behind the presentation of the sites, and the extent to which contemporary fieldwork has been and continues to be affected by politics. Hovering in the background at all times, at least at these two sites, are the legendary figures that have consistently been tied to them: Homer for Troy and Midas for Gordian. This discussion should begin with Troy, which is in many respects the more complex site in terms of archaeology and politics. Troy has been the focus of one controversy or another since antiquity, primarily because its name refers to both the site and its legends, which have consistently been joined together. The site's geographic location was distinctively advantageous in that it lay at the mouth of the Dardanelles or Hellespont, which served as one of the easiest crossing points between continental Europe and Asia. As a consequence, Troy was continually a locus of conflict between powers that lay at both east and west, and the site gradually acquired a kind of dual identity that's continued in a way to the present day. Between 1855 and 2012, during a period of over 150 years, there have been 3 major campaigns of excavation at the site. Those of Heinrich Schliemann and Wilhelm Dürpfeld, Karl Blegen of the University of Cincinnati, and Manfred Korfmann, Ernst Pernitzka, and me, representing the universities of Tübingen and Cincinnati. The critics of Schliemann's publications were vociferous in their objections to his interpretations, and divergent opinions about Troy's significance have surrounded every field project that's explored the site, including the most recent one. If one had to choose a single defining feature of the Schliemann excavations, it would be the discovery of the treasure of Priam, as he called it, in 1873. This was one of several assemblages of gold, silver, bronze, and lapis objects, primarily vessels and jewelry, that Schliemann connected to Troy's legendary king Priam. And even though he recognized before the end of his life that the treasures dated 1,000 years earlier than the period of conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolians, the Homeric foundations of the site of Troy were anchored in place at that time. Schliemann's search for a stratum that could be identified as Homer's Troy resulted in the destruction of an extensive amount of material in the center of the citadel, since he initially targeted the early Bronze Age, or Troy II levels, as the most likely to prove the historicity of the Trojan War. Many other archaeologists have made the same error in their decision to showcase one particular level of occupation in a multi-period site by removing the remains of later habitation, with the site of Gordian furnishing another case in point. At Troy, Schliemann documented little of what he removed. As such, the center of the citadel, at least the remains later than the 3rd millennium, are completely unknown, as one can see from this color phase plan of the 9 Trojan settlements. So the late Bronze Age phases are in red, as you see, and you'll notice a missing red patch, a missing red area in the center of the citadel. Nearly 40 years would pass until the next campaign of excavations, led by Carl Blegen of the University of Cincinnati between 1932 and 1938. Blegen's campaign had two primary objectives: to examine the stratigraphy of the citadel mound and to search for Bronze Age cemeteries, a search that still continues in spite of dramatic advances in remote sensing. There's no evidence to indicate that Troy and its excavations played any significant role in Turkish political discourse during this period of Blegen's campaign, which one also might have expected given the growing prominence of Troy in Turkish national identity. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when the story of the Trojan origin of the Turks began. It may go back as far as the 7th century AD, but it was certainly in place by the 12th century and was continually reinforced in the following centuries. When Mehmet II traveled to Troy in 1462, he reportedly stated that he had finally avenged the attacks on his kinsmen, the Trojans, by sacking Constantinople, the capital city of the Greeks, 9 years earlier. And after the Turkish victory at the Battle of Gallipoli in 1915, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk allegedly called out to Hector that his death had finally been avenged. Nevertheless, there were no celebrated visits by Ataturk to Troy during Blegen's campaign, in spite of Ataturk's interest in formulating a new Anatolian identity that involved both Hittites and Turks. Blegen ended his excavations at Troy in 1938, in part because, as he noted in his final excavation report, a sufficient amount of material should be left for the next generation of archaeologists who would have, no, it's serious, we do the same thing. The next generation of archaeologists who would have access to archaeological tools and techniques far superior to what existed in 1938. The other reason, without question, was that he hoped to complement the results of his fieldwork at Troy with the excavation of a Mycenaean palace in Greece, namely at Pylos, thereby, in a sense, following the model of Schliemann, who had undertaken fieldwork at both Troy and Mycenae. In terms of actual fieldwork, there was a hiatus between the end of the Blegen campaign in 1938 and the beginning of a new program of excavations in 1988, which were directed by Manfred Korfmann of the University of Tübingen in partnership with the University of Cincinnati, wherein I assumed responsibility for supervising post-Bronze Age excavations and research, or as I will call it, PBA. This new partnership was constructed in essence by Machteld Melink of Bryn Mawr and Getzel Cohen of Cincinnati, whom you see dressed as, I don't know, Hecuba and Priam in the upper right. The new team was intended to be multilingual or multinational, with German, American, and Turkish scholars working together as the primary stakeholders, and with a research program that accorded equal value to all phases of habitation at the site, from Neolithic through late Byzantine. As a signal of that expanded agenda, we began work on a version of Dürpfeld's color phase plan intended to unite graphically the results of Schliemann, Dürpfeld, and Blegen for the first time. We also agreed that we would commit up to 15 years to field work, but no more. We would excavate only as much as was absolutely necessary to answer our principal questions about settlement patterns, with the expectation, again, that future generations of archaeologists would have access to tools and techniques far superior to anything we could deploy. The system of trench sharing that we designed was somewhat unusual. In the areas that fell within the post-Bronze Age or PBA research program, we would dig down to the earliest PBA levels, after which the trench would be transferred to the Bronze Age team. When Korfmann and I designed the trench sharing agreement, we assumed that the division would be easy to determine. In most areas, the earlier excavators had found no layers earlier than Archaic, and in many trenches there were no strata between early Hellenistic and late Bronze Age. Nevertheless, the evidence that we uncovered in several trenches showed that there was less of a gulf between Bronze Age and post-Bronze Age than we had expected, and in some areas, less than a century. one can find several indications of the uncertainty as to who was responsible for the early Iron Age pottery if one peruses the volumes of Studia Troica, our annual excavation journal, especially those that were published during the excavation of the West Sanctuary. I considered those ceramics to be within the PBA sphere and labeled them 8A1. Korfmann, however, regarded them as Bronze Age and referred to them as 7B3 to reinforce their Bronze Age position. In other words, the proto-geometric period had become the focus of a kind of tug-of-war between us, and it highlighted for me the perils of dividing a site in two. I would later witness a similar problematic division at Gordian. Requiring immediate attention were the steadily disintegrating ruins of the site, especially the late Bronze Age fortification wall, which tourists routinely climb in imitation of the Homeric heroes. This was especially acute after the release of the 2004 film Troy. Our conservation strategy was as follows. New blocks added to a wall as infill would correspond to the shape and dimensions of the original stones. Yet those new blocks would be composed of smaller stones so that they could easily be identified as modern interventions. This conservation philosophy conformed fully with that of the 1964 Charter of Venice, wherein modern interventions need to be easily distinguishable from the original masonry, yet without detracting from the aesthetic integrity of the original building or structure being conserved. One of the reasons why we were so focused on the rescue of deteriorating ancient structures was because the first Gulf War had just occurred, and so much material culture in both Iraq and Kuwait had been destroyed. Both of us were deeply affected by this destruction, but especially Manfred, whose childhood had coincided with the end of World War II. One intervention, in a sense, took us back to the beginning of Schliemann's excavations. This involved a mud brick megaron of early Bronze Age date in quadrant G6, next to the latest Troy II, or early Bronze Age gate leading into the Citadel. The excavation began in 1998, in part because external financial support for the project was beginning to decrease, and there was a hope that the excavation of another Troy II megaron would yield an assemblage similar to the treasures that Schliemann had found. Although the discoveries from that excavation were by no means insignificant, the primary discovery was an intact megaron, the mud brick walls of which needed to be protected. The original walls were subsequently faced with modern mud brick, and a large curved sail-like canopy was erected above it as protection against rain and snow. This is one of the rare cases in which the conservation intervention contains its own iconography, in that the canopy was intended to highlight the importance of wind in the ancient commerce of Troy, and was positioned to evoke the height and shape of the mound as it existed when Schliemann first began to excavate there. One of the byproducts of our increased archaeological activity at Troy was a rise in the attention paid to the Homeric legends that had been attached to this area since antiquity. A particularly prominent component of the new activities was an annual spectacle generally referred to as the Troy Festival, during which a Judgment of Paris contest was staged again on Mount Ida, where the original contest had allegedly occurred. And as you see on lower right, still with 3 finalists, and still with the golden apple, although now made of paper mache. The Homeric associations of the Troad received even greater attention in 1993 when Schliemann's Treasure of Priam, believed to have been destroyed in Berlin at the end of World War II, appeared unexpectedly in the depot of Moscow's Pushkin Museum. There was no attempt to tie the legends of Homeric Troy to any of the new discoveries at the site, at least at the beginning of the project, nor does one find any mention of legendary epics in our initial archaeological reports. In 1993, however, one new discovery tied to remote sensing would bring both the Iliad and Atlantis into the discussion of Troy's archaeology in a way that could not have been anticipated. At the southern end of the lower city, magnetic perspection during the 1992 season had detected anomalies that were considered possible indications of a second Bronze Age fortification wall. Excavation during the following year yielded a rock-cut ditch, ostensibly intended as a fortification component, which demonstrated that the Bronze Age lower city was considerably larger than we had expected. A second, slightly larger ditch to the south of the first one was discovered in 1995, and it initially looked as if both ditches had completely encircled the lower city. The existence of such a defensive ditch in the Troy Lower Town, or outer residential district, was by no means unprecedented. Similar ditches of late Bronze Age and Iron Age date have been unearthed at sites in Turkey, Syria, and Israel, among others. But this was Troy, where defensive systems have consistently been placed in the shadow of the Iliad. And several unusual interpretations immediately began to appear. In 1992, Eberhard Sanger had published a book entitled Flood from Heaven, Deciphering the Atlantis Legend, in which he identified Troy as the source of the Atlantis story. Atlantis, of course, was reportedly encircled by canals, and Sanger quickly interpreted the newly discovered ditches as two of those canals, thereby fortifying the link between Troy and Atlantis that he had been attempting to establish. Most members of the staff accepted this as yet another highly idiosyncratic interpretation of Homeric Troy. But Korfmann was deeply troubled by it, and two refutations quickly appeared in Studia Troica. Sanger responded with a new broad-based analysis of the end of the Bronze Age, a new war in Troy, Archaeology in Crisis, in 1994, which included an epilogue critiquing Korfmann's excavation strategy and interpretation of the size of the Bronze Age lower city. Discussions of Atlantis and Plato were regular components of our conversations at Troy for the remainder of the 1990s, and Sanger's theories demonstrated the malleability of the site for scholarly purposes. At nearly the same time, the newly discovered ditches began to be discussed in connection with the defensive ditch mentioned in the Iliad in Book 7 that reportedly surrounded the Greek camp during the Trojan War. And the relevant passages in the Iliad were cited in two articles appearing in the 95 and 98 volumes of Studia Troica. Shortly thereafter, a Bronze Age seal inscribed in the Luwian script was found in a house dated to the 12th century BC, which represented the first writing, and to date the only writing, of Bronze Age date to have been unearthed at the site. In retrospect, this was the beginning of a period in which we were criticized for allowing the Homeric tradition to play too prominent a role in our fieldwork and research. The discovery of the seal prompted Korfmann to look more closely at potential links between Troy and the Hittite kingdom, where Luwian was one of the primary languages. And new advances in Hittite geography at the same time made it possible to link Troy with the Hittite vassal state of Wilusa, which is mentioned several times in texts recovered from the Hittite capital of Boazkoi. By 2000, the annual excavation report was entitled Excavations at Troy, Wilusa, and a large marble Ilios Wilusa sign was erected at the entrance to the site, although without explanation, so the average visitor to the site will surely have been confused. One of the Boazkoi tablets, dating to the early 13th century BC, records a treaty between the Hittite king Muwatalli II and the Wilusan ruler Alexandru. And since Alexandru is the Hittite version of Alexandros, the alternate name for Paris in the Iliad, the reference has been interpreted as Paris, ruler of Troy. Another tablet from Boazkoi, the so-called Tawagalawa letter, circa 1250 BC, was written by a Hittite king to his Ahiyawan or Achaean counterpart, and contains a fragmentary reference that's attracted considerable attention. It's been restored as, quote, about the matter of the land of Wilusa, concerning which he and I, the rulers of the Hittites and the Achaeans, were hostile to each other. This has been viewed as a kind of Homeric smoking gun, the conclusive evidence for a war between Greeks and Anatolians at Troy that so many had sought. And it brought the Iliad and the archaeological site of Troy even more closely together. Perhaps the most direct link between site and epic occurred in Korfmann's 1999 excavation report, where he noted, quote, I regard Homer as a contemporary witness to the physical conditions of Troy in 700 BC. All of these discoveries are relevant to the controversy surrounding the 2001 exhibit in Germany that focused on the past and present Troy excavations, entitled Troja Traum und Wirklichkeit, Troy Dream and Reality. Included in the exhibit, as well as the catalog, was a hypothetical axonometric reconstruction of Troy's lower city during the Late Bronze Age, which showed the district as densely inhabited. Our evidence for this reconstruction was limited, since we had excavated less than 2% of the lower city, and a surface survey of the area had not yet taken place. But it was presented as conjectural, and no one at the time considered that it would become as controversial as it subsequently did. The leader of the critics was Korfmann's Tübingen colleague, Frank Kolb, who pointed out that the evidence for such dense occupation in the Late Bronze Age was absent, as was proof that Troy was a major mercantile center at that time. Some of his arguments picked up on the criticisms made by Zonger in 1994, and the dispute developed into a kind of intellectual war with scholars lining up on either side of a Kolb-Korfmann line. The debate dominated conversations at Troy between 2001 and 2005, and the central event of that period was a conference in Tübingen in February of 2002, at which both groups presented their arguments for and against Troy's importance in the Late Bronze Age to an assembled audience of 800 and a live broadcast on German public radio, which was marketed, again, as a new Trojan War. At Troy itself, there was a visual byproduct of this debate, although it would not have been apparent to most viewers. One of the major disputes between Kolb and Korfmann had focused on Troy's role as a trading center during the Late Bronze Age. Korfmann had argued that the strong winds of the Dardanelles had prompted ships to seek safe harbor in the vicinity of Troy, which in turn was one of the causes of the settlement's prosperity. Kolb had disputed this, while casting doubt on the existence of Aegean Black Sea traffic during the Bronze Age. In 2001, new site banners were created with the phrase, "The wind brought wealth to Troy," framed by a drawing of the Luvian seal we had discovered. This phrase was translated into 4 languages and erected on all the flagpoles that lined the main entrance to the site. In 2002, after 15 years or 15 seasons of fieldwork, I ceased excavation, as Korfmann and I had agreed at the beginning of the project. But Korfmann was reluctant to stop because, as he said at the time, only continued excavation in the lower city could prove that Frank Kolb's criticisms were unfounded. During the same period, Süleyman Demirel, the president of Turkey, paid a visit to Troy and stressed the importance of the site for Turkey and for its relations to Europe. It was in 1999 that Turkey was recognized as a candidate for full membership in the European Union, and some argued at that time that Turkey should be accepted into the EU since it is the home of Troy, which is inextricably connected to the foundations of European culture. This makes a fascinating pendant to Rome's claims of Trojan ancestry and antiquity, and it raises again the issue of links between ancient Troy and modern Turkey, and especially between the Battle of Gallipoli and the Trojan War. Ataturk's alleged comment at the former battle about avenging Hector has already been mentioned, and several of the British soldiers who fought in the Gallipoli conflict viewed it as a second Trojan War, reading the Iliad on their way to Gallipoli and writing of Achilles in the poetry they composed. Another poem of 1919 has the fallen fighters speaking of their legendary counterparts, as if the soldiers of Troy and Gallipoli were now bound by ties of kingship. As one travels through the Dardanelles today, approaching the narrowest point between Europe and Asia, there are 2 powerful reminders that these 2 wars between East and West have consistently been linked. On the Asian side, in the city of Çanakkale, is the colossal wooden horse that had been used in the 2004 film Troy, standing as an obvious reminder of the area's connection to the wars of antiquity. It's on a 19-year long-term loan from Warner Brothers. I couldn't make that up. Directly across the straits is one of the most prominent of the Gallipoli War memorials, with a striding soldier pointing toward a monumental inscription that says, "Stop, traveler, the soil you tread once witnessed the end of an era." That sentence could be applied as well to several of the wars that were waged in and around Troy in antiquity. And it's noteworthy that the Troy citadel served as one of the Gallipoli lookout stations for Turkish soldiers, whose shells are occasionally found there. During the course of the excavation, the contemporary battles in the Middle East were a continual subject of discussion, and certainly Troy and the Trojan War have come to occupy an increasingly prominent role in discussions of modern conflicts. One can easily point to Achilles in Vietnam, Ajax in Iraq, or Odysseus in America as cases in point, or to the theater of war workshops, wherein performances of Sophocles' Ajax are tied to discussion of post-traumatic stress experienced by veterans in Iraq and Afghanistan. This raises the question as to whether contemporary politics played a role in our archaeological analysis. At least for me, I can think of only one related to my publications of the Polyxena sarcophagus, which dates to around 500 BC and was discovered in a tumulus in the Granicus River Valley, not far from Troy. The front is dominated by a scene at the end of the Trojan War, wherein Neoptolemus sacrifices Polyxena to the deceased Achilles, represented by the burial mound on the right of the frieze that I'm showing you. After the advent of the war in Iraq, I began to view and write about the sarcophagus differently, in that I realized that the carvers would have been designing and completing the scene of Polyxena's sacrifice while the Persian wars were being waged around them. I wondered whether the iconography of that scene was influenced by the sculptors' experiences in their own wars between East and West, and I incorporated such links into my analysis. To an extent, I suppose I had wrapped three East-West wars around this sarcophagus: Greeks versus Trojans, Greeks versus Persians, and the US versus Iraq. One of the most intriguing traits of the archaeologists who have conducted fieldwork at Troy is that they subsequently assumed the direction of other large sites that were intended to complement the information they acquired while digging at Troy. The first three archaeologists, Schliemann, Dürpfeld, and Blegen, moved to the Mycenaean palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, respectively, which enabled them to examine late Bronze Age habitation on both sides of the Aegean. Manfred Korfmann, as I mentioned above, believed that Troy's wealth in the late Bronze Age was partially related to its ability to provide safe harbor for ships sailing between the Aegean and Black Seas. Such a thesis, however, rests on the assumption that the Black Sea was open to Aegean maritime traffic during the Bronze Age, and there's currently insufficient evidence for such shipping prior to the 8th century BC. As a consequence, Korfmann recognized that a broader sphere of inquiry was necessary and turned his attention to the eastern Black Sea coast, launching excavations at two sites in Georgia, Didigora and Udabno, in an effort to unearth proof of Aegean traders there. This objective was ultimately not met, but Korfmann never abandoned his conviction that Mycenaean boats bound for the Black Sea had sought safe harbor at Troy, and his publication of the results from the Georgia excavations in Studia Troica made it seem as if there were a connection. In my case, I moved to another multi-period site in Turkey, that of Gordian, which also enjoyed a strong connection with legendary and heroic figures, especially Midas and Alexander. As the capital of the Phrygian kingdom, Gordian controlled much of Central Asia Minor during the Iron Age, and like Troy, the site appears to have received a sizable group of immigrants from southeastern Europe in the 12th century BC. The settlers who came to Troy probably crossed the Dardanelles, while those who arrived at Gordian probably traveled across the Bosphorus. The two sites therefore seemed complementary in many ways, especially temporally. Troy appears to have been wealthy in the late Bronze Age, but relatively impoverished in the Iron Age, and the reverse was true for Gordian. The Citadel of Gordian measures about 450 by 300 meters and is therefore nearly 4 times the size of that of Troy. As at Troy, 9 or 10 sequential settlements comprise Gordian's Citadel mound, with a lower city protected by a defensive wall and ditch. Habitation at Gordian begins later than Troy, circa 2300, so the site was inhabited for slightly less than 4 millennia versus slightly more than 4 millennia at Troy. Both sites are also products of long-term excavation. Fieldwork at Gordian has taken place since 1950, comprising a total of nearly 70 years, while 41 campaigns have occurred thus far at Troy. The first archaeologists who excavated extensively at both Troy and Gordian made strategic decisions about the final appearances of their sites. Which settlements would they choose to showcase, and with what kind of personality would they endow them? Although Schliemann probably gave little thought to this question, the end product of his campaign was the dominance of the early Bronze Age settlement, at least in the center of the Citadel mound. Rodney Young, the excavator of Gordian between 1950 and 1974, does appear to have given serious thought to this issue and decided to highlight Gordian's early Phrygian settlement, circa 950 to 800 BC. Much of that settlement had been covered and thus preserved by 5 meters of clay that was laid during a major construction project circa 800 BC, just after a significant fire, and several of the buildings, especially the Citadel Gate, were well preserved. Young was able to accomplish his objective by clearing away most of the structures that dated later than the early Phrygian period, or again the 9th century, although this made it seem as if the Citadel had housed only a single settlement rather than 9 of them, and as a consequence, the long history of the site was no longer readily apparent. It's often been noted that archaeologists sometimes exert undue influence on the public presentation of their sites, configuring them as they wish them to have appeared in antiquity. And to an extent, one can view this phenomenon in operation at Gordian as at Troy. Other factors prevented Gordian's Citadel mound and its material culture from being viewed synoptically. This relates primarily to a series of decisions made by the sponsoring institution, the Penn Museum, under whose auspices all of the excavations at Gordian have been conducted. Between 1950 and 1973, Rodney Young served as sole director, as did his successor, Keith DeVries, who conducted fieldwork between 75 and 87. Thereafter, however, the Penn Museum split Gordian's directorial responsibilities between 2 archaeologists at different institutions. Ken Sams from Chapel Hill became the overall site director, with responsibility for publishing Rodney Young's discoveries, while Mary Voigt of the College of William and Mary was appointed field director with her own excavation team and research strategy. Thus, for the next 25 years of fieldwork, there was a splintering of the accumulated data. Although field reports and articles were regularly published, truly synthetic analyses of the site and its discoveries became increasingly difficult to find, which was not unlike the situation we had created at Troy. Consequently, when I was appointed co-director of Gordian in 2007, my first objective was a color phase plan analogous to the one we had created at Troy, which was intended to combine the results of the Young and Voigt excavations. The completed plan unites the Phrygian era remains uncovered during the last 65 years and thereby elucidates the changing topography of the Citadel over the course of 6 centuries. This served as the basis for a 3D model of the site that was featured in the recent exhibit on Midas and Gordian at the Penn Museum, which again is rather reminiscent of the scenario surrounding the Troy exhibit 15 years ago, although this time there are fewer conjectural reconstructions. Rodney Young's most monumental undertaking had been his excavation in 1957 of Tumulus MM, the so-called Midas Mound, the 53-meter high burial mound that's now dated to 740 BC and associated with the father of Midas. Young was initially disinclined to excavate it, in part because of the difficulty of locating the tomb chamber in such an enormous tumulus. But Froelich Rainey, the Penn Museum director, was insistent on another sensational archaeological discovery, analogous to the royal tombs of Ur, and believed that the discovery of Midas's tomb would, quote-unquote, reverberate throughout the world. By drilling in the mound at 96 different points, Young was successful in finding the tomb chamber, which turned out to be the oldest standing wooden building in the world. Although the water used to cool the drills entered the tomb and damaged part of the funerary assemblage. One of the reasons why Rainey and Young were eager for such spectacular discoveries was that they had recently witnessed the end of partage, the system of sharing archaeological discoveries between the host country and the sponsoring institution. This meant that none of the Midas Mound objects could be acquired by Penn, nor could any other archaeological discoveries. But rather than limit the number of field projects in response to this change, the Penn Museum decided to intensify its fieldwork activity, believing that the increased publicity surrounding the new discoveries would compensate for the absence of the associated objects in the museum's collection. Penn appears to have been very much the outlier here. Many museums ceased their funding of fieldwork following the end of partage because they could no longer acquire legal title to the objects that were excavated. Partage had ended in part due to an increase in nationalism, and that's the topic I'd like to address in the final section of this talk. The last quarter century has witnessed a significant surge in nationalism, especially in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the concomitant changes in the governments of Eastern Europe, and more recently, the chain of revolutions in North Africa and the Middle East, commonly referred to as Arab Spring, wherein a new configuration of politics, religion, and ethnic identity have generated an expanding chain of armed conflict. Safety concerns in these zones of war have prompted a sharp decrease in the number of field projects, as well as the destruction of cultural property on an unusually large scale, not yet analogous to what was lost during World War II, but not far from it either. Field projects in Turkey are continuing, but not in the same way that they did in the past. We are now more frequently involved in claims for repatriation directed at the museums that support our projects. And we sometimes find ourselves serving as intermediaries between our own universities and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Permission to conduct fieldwork is now sometimes directly linked to these requests for repatriation. And the 1970 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property Protection is no longer regarded as a fixed principle around which such repatriation requests are organized. This was driven home to me seven years ago when Troy and Gordian became linked in a way I could not have anticipated. In September of 2011, the Penn Museum dealt with a repatriation request by Turkey regarding a collection of early Bronze Age gold that our museum had acquired from the art market in 1966. The assemblage in question consists of 24 pieces of gold jewelry dating to circa 2400 BC, similar in style to those in Schliemann Treasure of Priam, and therefore commonly referred to as the Troy gold in the Penn Museum. In the initial publications, written in the late 1960s by George Bass, then a curator at the Penn Museum, he highlighted the difficulty in pinpointing the provenance of the jewelry and was not convinced that all of the objects were from the same site. He noted their strong similarity to the early Bronze Age jewelry of Troy in northwest Turkey, Polyokni on Lemnos, and Ur in southern Iraq. The Penn Museum's Troy gold was subsequently published and exhibited in a variety of books and journals, especially after the rediscovery in 1993 of Schliemann's Treasure of Priam in Moscow. Despite the increased publicity for all things Trojan at that time, there were no claims for the repatriation of Penn's gold. In 2009, however, I brought two archaeometallurgists from Germany to examine the gold. A few particles of soil were found lodged inside one of the gold pendants, and neutron activation analysis revealed that the composition of the soil in the Penn gold was consistent with the soil in the plains of Troy. Ernst Perniczka, the lead scientist, said that it was not proof of provenance, but it was a good bet that Penn's enigmatic collection had come from somewhere in the region of Trojan influence, Turkey, Greece, or southeastern Europe. Toward the end of 2011, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism contacted the Penn Museum regarding the potential transfer of the gold to Turkey, based in large part on Pernitschka's scientific analysis. The request was both clear and firm. If we did not repatriate the gold, Penn would no longer be granted permission to work in Turkey again in any capacity, so Penn's expedition to Gordian would end. All of this happened shortly after Turkey had made a similar request to Germany regarding the repatriation of a Hittite sphinx from Boğazköy that had traveled to Berlin's Pergamon Museum in 1926. Turkey claimed that it traveled only for conservation. The Germans claimed it was a gift. Either way, Germany was told that they would lose the right to conduct research in Turkey if the Sphinx was not repatriated, and it was, of course, sent back. A series of discussions then took place between Penn and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism over the course of the next 11 months, from September of 2011 through August of 2012, in which I was the chief negotiator. When the discussions began, we pointed out that the gold had been purchased 4 years before the UNESCO Convention had been formulated. The officials from the ministry indicated that they were now following the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906, and they compared their claim to the Troy gold to NAGPRA in the US. That's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The museum director at that time, Richard Hodges, initially proposed a 30-year loan, which was rejected by the ministry. Shortly thereafter, we proposed an indefinite loan, which was the farthest the university was willing to go, since the precise provenance of the gold could not be established with 100% certainty. This too was initially declined, but then finally accepted by the Turkish ministry in April of 2012. What this meant was that the Troy gold would go indefinitely to Ankara, as it has. In return, the ministry promised strong support for the continuation of Penn's excavation at Gordian for as long as we like. Also promised was the loan to Penn of the assemblage from Gordian's Midas Mound for an exhibit of 1 year's duration. This exhibit, entitled The Golden Age of King Midas, opened at the Penn Museum 2 years ago, with 123 objects on loan from 4 museums in Turkey. As a result of this experience, I realized that strategic plans and research agendas for excavations need to be configured differently so that a publication can still be produced even if a permit for a site is abruptly canceled. The other reason for an unusually flexible research plan is that more and more of us now form collaborative ventures with archaeologists who are based in the host country, and one often needs to modify one's fieldwork so that it will be compatible with that of the local partner. It's relatively easy to view a site in long-term perspective and to place the associated activities and achievements in historiographic context. But it's far more difficult to predict what those sites will look like after another quarter century has passed. At sites such as Troy and Gordian, the legends associated with Homer and Midas will surely continue to be linked in some way to the fieldwork there. And as such, controversies involving archaeological interpretation will undoubtedly continue to occur. But we're gradually witnessing the end of a time in which a single foreign institution controls fieldwork at a site over the course of generations. And the next director of Gordian will probably be Turkish, as is now the case at Troy. I think it's unlikely that these two sites and their associated museums will be affected by the current political turmoil in the Middle East. And if that holds true, the sites will be all the more valuable since the ancient material culture of the surrounding countries will have been so seriously decimated. Moreover, since so many Near Eastern countries will be considered too potentially dangerous for fieldwork, the number of archaeologists who choose to specialize in this region of the world will probably eventually decrease, even though the number of graduate applications in ancient Middle Eastern archaeology and history have risen significantly since the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. These are times of transition, with the archaeological community gradually recognizing that the codes of conduct that have been in place for a century can no longer prevail in the countries in which we work or the world in which we live. For the student of archaeology today, then, the development of skills in diplomacy and creativity and resilience is just as important as those in archaeological techniques. Thank you for listening to me tonight. Thank you for your support of archaeology.